Welcome back, guys. Today, I will be reading some new Reddit stories while playing Minecraft. Leave a like and subscribe for more, and let's get started. Story 1. I need to get this off my chest because the nightmares have not stopped, and my therapist says I need to talk about it, but I cannot tell anyone in my real life without sounding completely insane. So I am posting it here, where at least some people might believe me, or at least entertain the possibility that I am telling the truth. My name is not important, but what I used to do for a living is relevant, because it is the only reason I ended up in the situation that has ruined my ability to sleep through the night for the last 3 years, since I was a commercial diver and underwater welder based out of Louisiana. And for 8 years, I worked the standard gigs in the Gulf of Mexico, repairing oil rigs, doing salvage on sunken vessels, and occasionally helping with underwater construction projects. It was dangerous work, but it paid well, and I was good at it. And I had developed a reputation for being able to stay calm under pressure, which is probably why I got the call. That changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and the voice on the other end was a woman with a flat effect who identified herself as a logistics coordinator for a private maritime contractor. She did not name the company, and she did not explain the job in any detail whatsoever. She simply asked if I was available for a 10-day contract starting the following Monday. And when I asked what the job entailed, she said deep water salvage. And when I asked where, she said international waters. And when I asked about the pay, she said $75,000 plus hazard bonuses with half deposited up front no matter what happened. I should have hung up immediately, because nothing about that call was normal. In my industry, you always know the company. You always know the vessel, you always know, at least the general location and the nature of the dive before you agree to anything. But I had just gone through a messy divorce, and my savings were depleted, and the idea of $75,000 for 10 days of work was enough to override every instinct in my body that told me to decline. And I said yes, and she gave me an address in Miami and told me to be there at 6 in the morning on Monday, with my gear and my passport and nothing else. No phone, no laptop, no camera, no journal. She said everything would be provided, and that I would be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement with penalties that would bankrupt me if I ever spoke about the work. I agreed, because I was stupid and desperate, and I had no idea that I was signing up for something that would make me question the fundamental nature of reality. I flew to Miami on Sunday night and checked into a cheap motel near the airport and spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. Thus at 5:30 Monday morning, I took a cab to the address, which turned out to be a private marina filled with yachts and high-end fishing boats and a single industrial vessel that looked like it had been retrofitted for research rather than commercial fishing. It was called the Meridian, and it was easily 200 feet long, with a helipad on the aft deck, and a massive crane amidships, and a dive chamber that looked brand new. There were only 8 people on board, including me and the captain and the crew and the other divers. The captain was a Norwegian man named Eric, who had clearly spent his entire life at sea, and who spoke only when absolutely necessary. And the other 2 divers were a pair of brothers from Florida named Marcus and Jesse, who had done saturation diving for the oil industry, and who seemed just as confused about the job as I was. There was a doctor named Chen, who stayed below deck most of the time, and 3 deckhands, who did not introduce themselves, and who seemed to be ex-military, based on their bearing and their haircuts. The woman who had called me was not on board, and no one mentioned her. We cast off without ceremony, and headed east into the Atlantic, and no one told us where we were going, or what we were looking for, as Eric had a sealed envelope with coordinates, and he opened it once we were 50 miles offshore, and plugged the numbers into the navigation system, and that was the only time I saw him show any emotion, because he raised his eyebrows and muttered something in Norwegian that sounded like a prayer. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head, and said we were going to a place where the water was 4 miles deep, and there was nothing there, according to every chart he had ever seen. We traveled for 3 days, and the atmosphere on the ship grew stranger with every hour. The deckhands conducted security sweeps of our quarters every morning, as if they expected us to be hiding something, and they monitored all radio traffic and satellite communications with equipment that looked military-grade. Dr. Chen took blood samples from all of us on the second day, and when I asked why, he said it was standard for deep saturation dives. But I had done dozens of saturation dives, and no one had ever taken my blood before a job. The brothers Marcus and Jesse spent most of their time playing cards and trying to guess what we were out there to find, and their theories ranged from a downed spy satellite to a sunken Russian submarine to a crashed aircraft full of gold. I mostly stayed quiet and watched the ocean and tried not to let my anxiety overwhelm me. On the third night, I was woken by a sound I had never heard on a ship before, which was the complete absence of sound. The engines had stopped, and the generator hum was gone, and for a moment I thought we had lost power entirely. But then I realized the ship was just drifting, and I went up on deck and found Eric standing at the railing, staring down at the water with a flashlight in his hand. He did not look at me when I approached, but he said in a quiet voice that we had arrived and that I should get some sleep because the first dive would be at dawn. I looked out at the water, and there was nothing to see, just black ocean stretching in every direction under a moonless sky, and yet the air felt heavy in a way I cannot properly describe, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us with some kind of invisible weight. I went back to my bunk and did not sleep. At 5 a.m, the deckhands were moving with purpose, and the crane was being prepared, and the dive chamber was pressurized, and Dr. Chen was checking our vitals with a thoroughness that made me uncomfortable. And I was paired with Marcus for the first dive, and we were told that we would be descending to 300 feet to inspect an object and to take photographs and measurements, but under no circumstances were we to touch it or attempt to collect samples. The object had apparently been discovered by an autonomous underwater vehicle 2 months prior, and the company that hired us had been conducting remote surveys ever since, but they needed human eyes on it before they decided how to proceed. We suited up in surface-supplied diving gear with redundant air supplies and communication lines, and Marcus and I entered the dive chamber together. The descent took 20 minutes, and the water was clear and blue for the first 100 feet, and then it began to change. By 200 feet, the water had taken on a strange quality that I had never seen before in all my years of diving. It was not darker exactly, but it was thicker somehow, as if the light was being absorbed rather than simply fading. My flashlight beam, which should have cut through the water for 30 feet or more, seemed to die after 10 feet, and the water itself felt different against my skin, even through the dry suit. Marcus noticed it too, and he said over the comms that something felt wrong, and the surface team told us to continue the descent and to report what we saw. At 280 feet, I saw it, and I froze because my brain could not process what my eyes were showing me. There on the seafloor was a perfect sphere, approximately 60 feet in diameter, and it was absolutely black. And I do not mean dark-colored or shadowed. I mean it was black in a way that seemed to devour the light from our flashlights. The sphere sat half buried in the sediment, and there was no visible seam or mark or texture on its surface. It looked like someone had punched a hole in reality and left a perfect circle of nothingness sitting on the ocean floor. Marcus started breathing heavily, and I realized I was doing the same, and the surface team was asking for a status report, and I could not find the words to describe what I was looking at. I managed to say that we had visual contact, and that the object was smooth and dark, and the surface team acknowledged in a tone that suggested they already knew exactly what we were seeing. We circled the sphere at a distance of about 20 feet, because both of us were instinctively afraid to get closer. Up close, the blackness was even more disturbing, because it had depth to it. When you look at a black wall or a black car, you see a surface, but this thing had no surface that I could perceive. It looked like a window into an infinite void, and the longer I stared at it, the more I felt like I was falling forward into it. Marcus took some photographs, with an underwater camera, and I used a measuring laser to confirm its dimensions. And then, we were ordered to return to the surface. We did not argue. The ascent felt like it took hours, even though it was only 20 minutes. And when we finally broke surface and were helped back onto the deck, I sat down and shook for 10 minutes without being able to stop. Jesse asked us what we saw, and Marcus just shook his head, and I said nothing because I did not know how to explain it. As Dr. Chen gave us both a sedative and checked our blood pressure and heart rate, and I overheard him speaking quietly with Eric in a tone that suggested this was not the first time divers had come back from that sphere in a state of shock. That night, the three of us sat in the galley and compared notes, and the brothers admitted that they had done a dive the previous week before I arrived, and they had seen the same thing, and they had been having nightmares ever since. Jesse said he kept dreaming about the sphere opening and something coming out, and Marcus said he dreamed about going inside and never coming back. I did not tell them about my own dream, which was stranger and more vivid than anything I had ever experienced. Yet in the dream, I was floating in front of the sphere, and it was humming at a frequency that I could feel in my bones. And then the black surface rippled like water, and I saw my own face looking back at me from inside, but the face was smiling in a way that I never smile, and the eyes were completely black. I woke up from that dream with a nosebleed and a headache that lasted all morning. The second dive was scheduled for the following day, and this time I went down with Jesse, and we were instructed to get closer to the sphere and to use handheld sonar to determine if it was hollow or solid. We descended again, and the water had the same strange, thick quality, and by the time we reached 300 feet, I was already feeling a low-level dread that I could not shake. Because the sphere looked exactly the same, except now there was something different about the sediment around it. On the first dive, the seafloor had been relatively flat and uniform, but now there were grooves in the sediment radiating outward from the sphere, like spokes on a wheel, and the grooves were perfectly straight and geometrically precise. Jesse scanned the sphere with sonar, and the readings made no sense. The sonar bounced off the surface and indicated that the sphere was solid and approximately 2 feet thick, but then secondary echoes suggested that the interior was a perfect vacuum, and then tertiary echoes suggested that the interior was larger than the exterior. Jesse checked his equipment 3 times, and each time he got different readings, and the surface team told us to collect a sample of the sediment from the grooves and to return, and I approached one of the grooves and shone my flashlight into it, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The groove was not just a mark in the sand. It was a channel cut into solid bedrock that had been covered by sediment over what must have been thousands of years, and the bedrock had been fused into glass. I touched the edge of the groove with my gloved hand, and the glass was perfectly smooth and sharp, and it looked like it had been cut by a laser or some kind of impossible heat. I collected the sample and backed away, and that was when I noticed that the sphere had changed. It was subtle, and I almost missed it, but the black surface now had a faint texture to it, like the skin of an orange viewed from far away, and the texture was moving. It was not moving like water or like smoke, but like something organic and breathing. And I grabbed Jesse and pointed, and he saw it too, and we both heard the surface team say abort. Abort, abort in our headsets, and we did not need to be told twice. We ascended faster than we should have, and neither of us cared about decompression sickness at that moment, because the only thing that mattered was getting away from that thing. Back on the ship, Eric was pale, and the deckhands were checking weapons, which was something I had never seen on a civilian vessel, and Dr. Chen took our samples and locked them in a safe without examining them in front of us. That night, I lay in my bunk and listened to the ship creaking, and I realized that the Meridian was not just a salvage vessel. It was a containment vessel, and we were not there to recover something. And we were there to make sure whatever that sphere was stayed right where it was. I got up and went to the galley for water, and found Eric sitting alone in the dark drinking coffee. He looked at me for a long time, And then he said that he had been captain of this ship for 11 years, and that this was his 7th trip to the sphere, and that every time they came back, the sphere was different. He said the first time it had been a cube, and the second time it had been a pyramid, and the third time it had been a shape that hurt to look at, and now it was a sphere, and he did not know what it would be next time. He said the company paid him $2 million per trip, and he did not know their name, and he did not ask questions, and he was pretty sure that none of the previous dive teams had been allowed to go home and tell anyone what they had seen. And I asked him what he thought it was, and he said he thought it was a door, and he thought someone or something was knocking on the other side, and he thought eventually it would open. Then he stood up and left, and I sat there in the dark until dawn, wondering if he was insane, or if I was, or if the world was much stranger than anyone on land was allowed to know. The third dive was supposed to be routine, just a perimeter check and water sampling, and then we would head back to Miami, and I would collect my money and try to forget everything I had seen. I went down with Marcus again, and we brought a remote-operated vehicle to do a close pass of the sphere, so we would not have to get near it ourselves. We launched the ROV, and it descended toward the sphere, and its camera feed was displayed on a monitor in our helmets. The ROV got within 10 feet of the surface, and then the feed cut to static, and Marcus said he was going to bring it back, and I said okay. And then the static cleared, and the camera showed something impossible. The sphere was open, not cracked or damaged, but open like an eye or a flower, and the interior was not black, but white, and the white was so bright that it hurt to look at even through the monitor, and in the center of the white was a shape that I cannot describe properly, because my memory refuses to hold it clearly. It was tall and thin, and it had too many joints, and its head was wrong, and it was moving in a way that made me nauseous. And then it looked directly at the camera, and the ROV exploded. I do not mean it malfunctioned or shorted out, and the titanium housing split open like a banana peel, and the components scattered across the seafloor, and Marcus and I both screamed and started ascending immediately. But then Marcus stopped, and I turned around, and he was floating perfectly still, staring down at the sphere, and I grabbed his arm, and he did not respond. I shook him, and his helmet turned toward me, and I saw his face through the visor, and he was smiling that same impossible smile from my dream, and his eyes were rolled back to show only the whites, and he said in a voice that was not his voice that I should come inside, because it was warm and safe, and they had been waiting for me specifically. I let go of him and kicked upward with every ounce of strength I had, and I did not look back, and I did not stop until I was back in the dive chamber, and the hatch was sealed behind me. As when I was helped back onto the deck, I was hysterical, and Dr. Chen sedated me, and I woke up 12 hours later in my bunk with a bandage on my arm, where they had apparently given me an IV. Eric was sitting in a chair next to my bed, and he told me that Marcus had not come back, and that the official story would be that he had suffered equipment failure and drowned, and that his body had been lost at 4,000 feet. Eric told me that if I ever spoke about what really happened, they would find me, and they would make me disappear, and he said it with such flat certainty that I believed him completely. For he also told me that the Meridian was leaving immediately, and that I would be dropped in the Bahamas with a new passport and a bank account in the Cayman Islands with $200,000, and that I should never contact anyone from the crew again. I asked about Jesse, and Eric said Jesse had been transferred to another vessel, and I would not see him again. I did not ask what that meant. We reached the Bahamas the next day, and a man in a suit met me on the dock and gave me a phone with a single number programmed into it, and he said if I ever saw the sphere again in my dreams, I should call the number, and someone would come to help me. I asked what would happen if I did not call, and he said then I would end up like Marcus, which I took to mean dead or worse. That was 3 years ago, and I have not spent a single night since then, without waking up at least once in a cold sweat. The dreams have gotten worse, and in the last 6 months, I have started seeing the sphere when I am awake. I will be walking down the street and catch a reflection in a store window, and for just a fraction of a second, it will be that perfect black circle instead of my own face. I will be in the shower and close my eyes and see the white interior and the thing with too many joints looking at me. 2 weeks ago, I woke up and found a groove in the floorboards of my bedroom that was not there before, and it was perfectly straight, and the wood had been turned to glass, and I have not called the number, because I am afraid that the people who answer are not trying to help me, but are trying to see if I am ready to go back, or ready to be silenced. I moved to a cabin in rural Montana, where the nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and I keep the lights on all night, and I drink too much, and I jump at every shadow. I know this story sounds insane, and I know that if I had read it online 3 years ago, I would have called it creative writing, or a hoax. But I am telling you this because something is happening to me that I do not understand, and I am terrified that the sphere is not just a place or an object, but some kind of process or infection, and that Marcus was not taken, but was changed, and that I am changing too. That last night, I woke up standing in my kitchen with a knife in my hand, and I had carved that same geometric pattern into the wall, and I was smiling in the mirror when I caught my reflection, and for just a moment, my eyes looked black. I do not know how much time I have left before I am not myself anymore, and I needed someone somewhere to know the truth, in case I disappear, or in case someone finds this cabin empty with no sign of where I went. If you ever get a call offering you ridiculous money to dive in international waters with no questions asked, you hang up, and you keep hanging up no matter how desperate you are. There are things in the deep places of this world that should stay buried, and there are doors that should never be opened, and I am pretty sure I am becoming the key to one of them, and I do not know how to stop it. And I'm sorry for the long post, but I needed to tell someone before it is too late. And if this gets deleted, or if I stop posting, you will know that they found me, or that I went inside, and I am never coming back. Story 2. The basement archive sat 3 levels beneath the municipal records building, where the air always carried a faint scent of vinegar and aging paper. The position opened through a civil service posting that listed film preservation and catalog maintenance as primary duties. I applied during a stretch of unemployment that left me questioning whether I still had the patience for detailed work. The interview consisted of a basic mechanical aptitude test and a question about how I handled repetitive tasks. I answered that repetition was not the enemy of attention, but the foundation of it. They hired me 2 days later. The access door required a key card and a manual turn of a heavy brass handle. The corridor beyond sloped downward into a climate-controlled space, maintained at 62 degrees and 40% relative humidity. The lighting consisted of fluorescent tubes, fitted with ultraviolet filters to prevent photochemical degradation. The shelving units rose to the ceiling in parallel rows. Each bay held hundreds of metal film canisters, stacked in chronological order, or left in unmarked cardboard boxes waiting for assessment. My workstation sat near the center aisle. It featured a stainless steel inspection table, a manual rewind stand, a splicing block, a magnifying loop mounted on an adjustable arm, and a compact cleaning station with lint-free wipes and distilled solvent. The work did not involve digital editing or high-speed automation, and it involved hands, patience, and a willingness to move at the speed of physical media. The first week consisted of orientation and inventory mapping. I learned the archival classification system. I memorized the storage protocols. I practiced handling brittle acetate stock without applying uneven pressure. I learned to identify vinegar syndrome by smell and by the characteristic curling of film edges. I logged the location of each unmarked box. I noted the dimensions of the canisters. I recorded the condition of the leader tape. The work felt slow but purposeful. My hands adapted to the weight of the reels. My eyes adjusted to the low contrast of faded emulsion. My breathing settled into a steady rhythm that matched the manual crank of the inspection stand. I did not rush. I did not skip steps. I cleaned each reel before threading it, and I inspected the sprocket holes for damage. I checked the splice points for weakness. I noted any mold growth or chemical staining. The archive did not demand brilliance. It demanded consistency. I provided it. The basement felt isolated from the city above, but the isolation felt intentional. The temperature remained constant. The humidity stayed regulated. The light stayed filtered. The space operated as a closed system designed to slow decay. I adapted to that design. I moved through the aisles with deliberate steps. I carried trays of reels between the storage bays and the inspection table. I kept my notes organized. I maintained clean surfaces. I respected the material. The work felt grounding. The city above continued its noise, but the basement held its quiet. By the end of the second week, I reached the unmarked collection stored in Bay 7. The boxes had been transferred from a defunct community theater that closed decades earlier. No inventory list accompanied the transfer. No accession numbers were stamped on the cardboard. The reels sat loose inside the containers without protective sleeves. The metal canisters showed surface oxidation. The paper labels had peeled away or faded into illegible stains. I began the assessment process. I opened the first box. I removed 3 reels. I placed them on the inspection table. I wiped the outer surfaces. I checked the reel hubs for rust. I tested the tension of the wound film. The first reel showed moderate edge curl but stable emulsion. I threaded it onto the rewind stand. I engaged the hand crank. I advanced the film slowly under the loop. The frames revealed a street scene from what appeared to be the late 1960s. Automobiles with rounded fenders parked along a brick-lined avenue. Pedestrians in wool coats walking past storefronts with hand-painted signage. The image quality showed moderate contrast loss, but retained clear detail in the architectural lines. I noted the approximate date. I logged the condition. I continued the inspection. The second reel showed a public gathering in a park. Musicians on a temporary stage. Families seated on folding chairs. Children running across grass. The frames captured motion blur that indicated a slower shutter speed. The emulsion held well. The color balance leaned toward warm amber tones typical of aging color film stock. I logged the observations. I moved to the third reel. Yet the leader tape bore a single word written in fading blue ink. November. I did not know what November referenced. It could have been a production title. It could have been a date. It could have been a label applied by someone who knew the content and left no further context. I threaded the reel carefully. I advanced the film frame by frame. The initial sequence showed an empty hallway with linoleum flooring and fluorescent lighting. The camera panned slowly across closed doors. The movement felt deliberate. The framing stayed level. The image remained stable. I continued cranking. The scene shifted to a stairwell. The steps descended out of frame. The walls showed water stains near the baseboards. The camera lingered on a fire extinguisher mounted beside a wooden handrail. The footage felt observational rather than narrative. As I advanced further, the frames revealed a basement room identical to the one I worked in. The shelving units matched the current layout. The inspection table sat in the same position. The lighting fixtures showed older tube designs. The footage captured a person standing near the storage bays. The figure wore a dark sweater and light trousers. The face remained out of frame. The person reached for a canister on the second shelf. They lifted it. They carried it toward the table. The camera followed the movement. The footage ended with a cut to Black Leader. I rewound the reel. I logged the content. I noted the location match. I considered the possibility that the footage originated from an earlier archival employee documenting their own workspace. The observation felt plausible. I stored the reel in a new acid-free container. I labeled it with a temporary identifier. I moved to the next box. The fourth week brought a pattern. Several reels in base 7 carried single word labels. August, December, Thursday, river. Each label corresponded to a specific sequence of footage. None of the reels contained titles or credits. None of the sequences followed conventional editing structure. The footage appeared continuous. The camera operated on a single tripod mount, or a slow handheld glide. The subjects varied from interior rooms to outdoor streets to quiet industrial areas. The lighting remained natural or ambient. No artificial setups appeared. The operator avoided zooming. The framing stayed wide or medium. The pacing felt unhurried. I began to suspect the collection represented a personal documentation project rather than a commercial or municipal archive. Like the consistency of the visual language supported the theory. The camera operator favored still compositions. They allowed scenes to play out without interruption. They captured mundane moments with careful attention to detail. I logged each reel. I noted recurring locations. I cross-referenced street signs with historical city maps. I matched architectural features with archival photographs stored in the municipal database. The correlations appeared accurate. The footage dated from the 1970s through the early 1990s. The operator documented the same geographic area across multiple decades. The changes in the environment appeared gradual. Storefronts shifted signage. Vehicles updated models. Trees grew taller. Pavement cracked and repaired. The footage felt like a visual diary of a specific radius, and I felt no urgency to rush the assessment. I maintained the inspection pace. I cleaned the reels. I repaired damaged splices. I stabilized brittle sections with archival tape. I stored the processed reels in climate-controlled boxes. I kept the logbook updated. The work felt methodical. The archive felt like a puzzle assembling itself. The fifth week introduced a shift in the footage content. The labeled reels began to show recurring figures. The same individuals appeared in different sequences separated by years. A woman in a light coat, standing near a crosswalk. A man in a dark hat sitting on a park bench. A child wearing a striped sweater, walking alongside a bicycle. The figures did not interact with the camera. They did not acknowledge its presence. They simply existed within the frame. The operator captured them in passing moments. The woman adjusted her scarf. The man fed pigeons from a paper bag. The child paused to tie a shoelace. The footage did not dramatize the actions. It recorded them. I felt a quiet recognition. The operator did not seek stories. They sought presence. I continued the inspection. I noticed that the recurring figures appeared in the same locations across different years. The crosswalk remained at the same intersection. The bench sat beneath the same oak tree. The sidewalk showed the same crack pattern. The environment held consistency while the people aged. The footage documented time through repetition rather than progression. I logged the observations. I updated the location database. I matched the visual markers to municipal records. The correlations held, yet the archive felt less like a collection of random films and more like a structured observation system. I felt no need to identify the operator. I felt only respect for the discipline required to maintain such a project. The work demanded patience. The operator possessed it. I mirrored it. The sixth week brought the first instance of environmental interaction. A reel labeled Rain showed a continuous sequence filmed from beneath a covered awning. The camera faced outward toward a street intersection. Water fell steadily. The pavement darkened. Puddles formed along the curb. Pedestrians moved quickly with umbrellas. Vehicles passed with tires hissing on wet asphalt. The camera did not pan. It did not zoom. It held the frame. The footage lasted nearly 40 minutes without cuts. The soundtrack remained silent, as the film was shot without audio recording capability. The visual rhythm carried the weight of the scene. Water dripped from the awning edge. Leaves floated in the runoff. Reflections shifted on the street surface. The operator allowed the moment to breathe. I watched the frames under the loop. I noted the consistency of the exposure. I checked for light leaks or chemical fogging. The emulsion held clean. The contrast remained stable. I logged the duration. I recorded the weather conditions based on historical meteorological data. The correlation matched. I stored the reel. I felt a quiet appreciation for the restraint. The footage did not demand attention. It offered it. I continued the inspection. I encountered more reels with similar approaches. I had a sequence labeled Wind, captured tree branches swaying against a gray sky. A reel labeled Shadow showed sunlight moving across a brick wall over several hours. A canister, marked Quiet, held footage of an empty library reading room, with dust particles visible in the air. The collection emphasized atmosphere over narrative. I adjusted my assessment criteria. I stopped searching for plot or context. I began documenting visual patterns and environmental conditions. The archive responded to the shift. The work felt aligned with the material. The 7th week introduced a new layer of complexity. A reel labeled Glass contained footage of a large storefront window. The camera faced inward from the street. The interior showed a room filled with shelves holding identical metal canisters. The layout matched the basement archive I worked in. The lighting matched the current setup. The inspection table sat in the same position. The footage captured a person moving through the space. The figure wore the same dark sweater I had seen in the November reel. They placed a canister on the table. They threaded a reel. They advanced the film manually. The camera recorded the process in real time. I felt a sudden alignment. The footage was not a historical document of a different space. It was a document of this space. The archive had been filming itself decades ago. The operator sat in the exact position I occupied. The equipment differed, but the layout remained unchanged. I rewound the reel. I reviewed the frames again. I noted the details. The ventilation grates showed older designs. The fluorescent tubes carried different end caps. The floor tiles displayed a pattern that had been replaced during a renovation. The structural elements matched. The workflow matched. The only difference was time. I logged the discovery. I updated the archive records. I cross-referenced the footage date with building maintenance logs. The correlation appeared accurate. The basement had housed film storage since the 1950s. The operator documented the space across multiple decades. I felt no surprise. I felt continuity. The archive was not a static repository. It was a living record of its own preservation. I adjusted my perspective. I stopped viewing the material as external history. I viewed it as internal documentation. The work felt circular. The space felt self-aware. I continued the inspection. The 8th week deepened the pattern, and the labeled reels began to show sequences that mirrored my own daily routine. A reel labeled Morning captured the inspection table at dawn, with light filtering through a high ventilation window. A canister marked Cleaning showed a hand wiping down a stainless steel surface with a lint-free cloth. A reel labeled Log displayed a notebook open to a blank page, with a pen resting beside it. The footage did not depict me specifically. It depicted the actions I performed. It depicted the environment I occupied. The operator documented the same tasks across different years. The consistency felt deliberate. The archive recorded its own maintenance. The footage emphasized process over personality. I felt no discomfort. I felt recognition. The work required repetition. The repetition required attention. The attention required stillness. The operator understood this. I understood it now. I continued the inspection. I matched the sequences to historical building access records. The footage aligned with documented maintenance schedules. The operator appeared during off hours. They worked without supervision. They left no notes. They left only the reels. I stored the processed canisters. I updated the inventory. I maintained the climate controls. I kept the workspace clean. The archive felt like a conversation across time. I listened. I responded through preservation. The 9th week brought a shift in the visual quality. The older reels showed increased emulsion degradation. The color balance drifted toward magenta. The contrast flattened. The sprocket holes showed micro-tears. The film required careful handling. I adjusted the cleaning protocol. As I reduced solvent application, I increased manual inspection frequency. I repaired splices with archival adhesive. I stabilized brittle sections with gentle heat treatment. The work slowed but remained steady. I documented each intervention. I noted the chemical changes. I tracked the degradation rates. I compared the footage to newer reels, showing the same locations. The differences appeared predictable. The older material faded. The newer material retained clarity. The archive demonstrated the reality of physical decay. I felt no urgency to reverse it. I felt only commitment to slowing it. The preservation process required acceptance. The film would not last forever. The footage would not remain pristine. My role was to extend its life. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. And I logged the conditions. The work felt honest. The archive felt real. The 10th week introduced a new observational layer. I noticed that the footage contained subtle environmental markers that changed predictably across decades. A street lamp showed progressive rust accumulation. A brick wall displayed expanding mortar cracks. A tree trunk thickened visibly. A sidewalk edge shifted elevation due to root growth. The footage documented urban aging without commentary. The operator captured the changes as they occurred. The sequences felt like time-lapse photography executed at human scale. I cross-referenced the visual markers with municipal infrastructure reports. The correlations matched construction dates. They matched weathering cycles. They matched seasonal variations. The footage functioned as an independent verification system. Second, I updated the archival database. I linked the film sequences to public records. The archive gained new utility. The material was not only historical documentation, it was environmental data. I adjusted my cataloging method. I added temporal markers. I added location coordinates. I added condition metrics. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the records. The system felt complete. The 11th week brought a quiet revelation. A reel labeled Return contained footage of the basement archive from a slightly elevated angle. The camera sat on a shelf near the ceiling. The frame captured the entire workspace, the inspection table, the storage bays, the ventilation ducts, the lighting fixtures. The footage showed a person entering the frame. They wore a dark sweater, and they carried a tray of reels. They placed the tray on the table. They began the inspection process. The camera recorded the sequence for 20 minutes. The person worked methodically. They cleaned the film. They advanced the frames. They logged the observations. They stored the reels. The sequence ended with the person leaving the frame. The camera remained stationary. The basement stayed quiet. I rewound the reel. I reviewed the footage. I recognized the workflow. I recognized the posture. I recognized the rhythm. The operator was not a ghost. They were a predecessor. They performed the same tasks I performed. They maintained the same space I maintained. They documented the same process I documented. The footage did not feel haunting. It felt validating. The archive preserved its own continuity. I logged the observation. Yes, I updated the records. I maintained the routine. I felt grounded. The work required no explanation. It required only presence. The 12th week deepened the archival practice. I began to notice that the footage contained micro-variations in lighting that corresponded to seasonal solar angles. The high ventilation window cast longer shadows during winter months. The light struck the inspection table at a lower angle during summer. The footage recorded these shifts without adjustment. The operator did not compensate for changing conditions. They allowed the environment to dictate the exposure. The footage reflected natural light cycles. I documented the variations. I mapped the solar angles to historical astronomical data. The correlations held. The archive captured celestial mechanics indirectly. The basement operated as a light meter. The film recorded the passage of time through illumination. I updated the catalog. I added solar tracking metrics. I linked the footage to seasonal records. The archive gained new dimension. The material was not only visual documentation, it was chronological evidence. I maintained the preservation protocol. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The work felt integrated. The archive felt connected. The 13th week introduced a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the footage as external material. I began viewing it as a continuation of my own practice. The operator did not seek fame. They sought consistency. They did not chase narrative. They honored process. They documented the space because the space required witness. I mirrored that approach. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the archive to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing meaning onto the footage. I allowed meaning to emerge naturally. I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the inspection rhythm. I noticed that my posture adjusted to the workspace layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the basement environment. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent preservation. The archive provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 14th week brought a new layer of environmental interaction, and I noticed that the film stock reacted differently to storage conditions, depending on the decade of production. Older acetate-based stock showed faster vinegar syndrome progression. Newer polyester-based stock retained stability longer. The footage documented its own material degradation. The operator captured the changes across years. The sequences showed progressive emulsion loss. They showed increasing edge curl. They showed fading contrast. The footage served as a preservation timeline. I documented the degradation rates. I compared the footage to chemical analysis reports. The correlations matched. The archive functioned as a laboratory. The film recorded its own decay. I updated the preservation protocols. I adjusted storage temperatures. I modified humidity controls. I segregated stock by base material. I tracked degradation metrics. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. The 15th week deepened the observational practice. I began to notice that the footage contained recurring visual motifs that repeated across decades. A cracked pavement line, a rusted fire escape, a faded storefront sign, a leaning utility pole. The operator captured the same elements repeatedly. The sequences documented slow change through static framing. The footage felt like a meditation on permanence and decay. I logged the motifs. I mapped their locations. I tracked their progression. I linked the sequences to municipal maintenance records. The correlations held. The archive functioned as an independent monitoring system. The footage recorded urban aging without intervention. I updated the catalog. I added decay tracking metrics. I linked the material to infrastructure reports. The archive gained new utility. The work felt integrated. The space felt connected. The 16th week brought a shift in the preservation methodology. I stopped applying chemical treatments unless degradation threatened structural integrity. I allowed the film to age naturally within controlled parameters. I adjusted the cleaning protocol to minimize solvent exposure. I increased manual inspection frequency. I documented each intervention. I noted the chemical changes. I tracked the degradation rates. I compared the footage to historical preservation standards. The differences appeared predictable. Older protocols emphasized intervention. Newer standards emphasized stabilization. And the archive demonstrated the evolution of preservation philosophy. I felt no urgency to reverse aging. I felt only commitment to extending life. The work required acceptance. The film would not last forever. My role was to slow the process. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 17th week introduced a new observational layer. I noticed that the footage contained subtle audio cues, captured accidentally by the camera mechanism. The shutter motor produced a consistent rhythmic click. The rewind gear emitted a low hum. The film transport generated a steady friction sound. The footage recorded the mechanics of its own creation. The operator captured the process indirectly. The sequences functioned as acoustic documentation. I documented the sound patterns, I compared them to equipment maintenance logs. The correlations matched. The archive recorded its own machinery. The footage preserved the rhythm of the workspace. I updated the catalog. I added mechanical tracking metrics. I linked the material to equipment records. The archive gained a new dimension. The work felt integrated. The space felt alive. The 18th week deepened the archival practice. I began to notice that the footage contained environmental markers that shifted predictably with seasonal changes. Dust accumulation increased during dry months. Condensation patterns formed during humid periods. Light diffusion changed with atmospheric clarity. The operator captured the variations without adjustment. The footage recorded the basement microclimate. I documented the shifts, as I compared them to climate control logs. The correlations held. The archive functioned as a monitoring station. The film recorded environmental stability. I updated the preservation protocols. I adjusted ventilation cycles. I modified humidity controls. I tracked environmental metrics. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. The 19th week brought a quiet realization. The operator did not document the city to preserve history. They documented the archive to preserve attention. The footage emphasized stillness over motion. It emphasized consistency over novelty. It emphasized presence over production. The operator understood that preservation requires witness. I understood it now. I continued the inspection. I cleaned the reels. Once I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. I felt no urgency to complete the project. I felt only commitment to the process. The work required patience. I provided it. The archive required attention. I offered it. The space required stillness. I maintained it. The routine felt natural. The footage felt familiar. The preservation felt purposeful. The 20th week introduced a shift in the cataloging system. I stopped organizing by date or location. I began organizing by preservation status. I grouped stable reels together. I isolated degrading reels. I prioritized intervention based on structural risk. I adjusted storage allocation accordingly. I modified climate control zones. I tracked degradation progression. I documented each adjustment. I noted the environmental response as I logged the preservation outcomes. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 21st week deepened the observational practice. I began to notice that the footage contained recurring framing patterns that matched the architecture of the basement. The shelving units aligned with the camera angle. The inspection table sat at the visual center. The ventilation ducts framed the upper edge. The operator composed the shots deliberately. The footage recorded the space as a structured environment. I documented the patterns. I mapped the camera positions. I tracked the framing consistency. I linked the sequences to architectural blueprints. The correlations held. The archive functioned as a spatial record. The footage preserved the layout. I updated the catalog. I added framing metrics. I linked the material to structural records. The archive gained new dimension. The work felt integrated. The space felt connected. The 22nd week brought a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the footage as historical material. I began viewing it as a living record of ongoing preservation. The operator did not seek completion. They sought continuity. They did not chase endings. They honored process. They documented the space because the space required witness. I mirrored that approach. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the archive to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing meaning onto the footage. I allowed meaning to emerge naturally. I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the inspection rhythm. I noticed that my posture adjusted to the workspace layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the basement environment. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent preservation. The archive provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 23rd week introduced a new layer of environmental interaction. I noticed that the film stock responded to storage conditions in predictable ways. Older material showed increased brittleness during dry periods, and a newer material retained flexibility during stable humidity. The footage documented its own material state. The operator captured the changes across years. The sequences showed progressive stabilization. They showed reduced edge curl. They showed maintained contrast. The footage served as a preservation timeline. I documented the stabilization rates. I compared the footage to chemical analysis reports. The correlations matched. The archive functioned as a laboratory. The film recorded its own maintenance. I updated the preservation protocols. I adjusted storage temperatures. I modified humidity controls. I segregated stock by condition. I tracked stability metrics. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. In the 24th week deepened the archival practice. I began to notice that the footage contained recurring environmental markers that repeated across decades. A consistent dust pattern on the inspection table. A fixed shadow cast by the ventilation grate. A stable light diffusion through the filtration panels. The operator captured the same elements repeatedly. The sequences documented stability through static framing. The footage felt like a meditation on consistency and care. I logged the markers. I mapped their locations. I tracked their permanence. I linked the sequences to maintenance schedules. The correlations held. The archive functioned as an independent monitoring system. The footage recorded environmental stability without intervention. I updated the catalog. I added stability tracking metrics. And I linked the material to operational records. The archive gained new utility. The work felt integrated. The space felt connected. The 25th week brought a quiet realization. The operator did not document the archive to preserve memory. They documented it to preserve attention. The footage emphasized stillness over motion. It emphasized consistency over novelty. It emphasized presence over production. The operator understood that preservation requires witness. I understood it now. I continued the inspection. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. I felt no urgency to complete the project. I felt only commitment to the process. The work required patience. I provided it. The archive required attention. I offered it. The space required stillness. I maintained it. The routine felt natural. The footage felt familiar. The preservation felt purposeful. The 26th week introduced a shift in the cataloging system. I stopped organizing by date or location. I began organizing by preservation priority. I grouped critical reels together. I isolated stable reels. I adjusted storage allocation accordingly. I modified climate control zones. I tracked degradation progression. I documented each adjustment. I noted the environmental response. I logged the preservation outcomes. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 27th week deepened the observational practice. I began to notice that the footage contained recurring framing patterns that matched the workflow of the basement. The inspection table aligned with the camera angle. The storage bays framed the background. The lighting fixtures occupied the upper visual field. The operator composed the shots deliberately. The footage recorded the space as a functional environment. I documented the patterns. I mapped the camera positions. I tracked the framing consistency. I linked the sequences to operational manuals. The correlations held. The archive functioned as a workflow record. The footage preserved the process. I updated the catalog. I added workflow metrics. I linked the material to procedural records. The archive gained new dimension. The work felt integrated. The space felt connected. Even the 28th week brought a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the footage as external material. I began viewing it as a continuation of my own practice. The operator did not seek completion. They sought continuity. They did not chase endings. They honored process. They documented the space because the space required witness. I mirrored that approach. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the archive to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing meaning onto the footage. I allowed meaning to emerge naturally. I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the inspection rhythm. I noticed that my posture adjusted to the workspace layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the basement environment. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear, and I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent preservation. The archive provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I cleaned the reels. I repaired the damage. I stored the material. I logged the conditions. The 29th week introduced a new layer of environmental interaction. I noticed that the film stock responded to storage conditions in predictable ways. Older material showed increased brittleness during temperature fluctuations. Newer material retained flexibility during stable cycles. The footage documented its own material state. The operator captured the changes across years. The sequences showed progressive stabilization. They showed reduced edge curl. They showed maintained contrast. The footage served as a preservation timeline. I documented the stabilization rates, and I compared the footage to chemical analysis reports. The correlations matched. The archive functioned as a laboratory. The film recorded its own maintenance. I updated the preservation protocols. I adjusted storage temperatures. I modified humidity controls. I segregated stock by condition. I tracked stability metrics. The work expanded without losing focus. The archive responded to the structure. The footage aligned with the data. The system felt complete. The 30th week marked the end of the initial assessment cycle. The Municipal Records Department transmitted a standard notice. Phase 1 complete. Inventory verified. Preservation protocols updated. Data archive secure. I read the message. I acknowledged it. I began the transition sequence. I powered down non-essential equipment. I backed up the digital logs. I sealed the inspection table. I cleaned the surfaces. I checked the storage bays. I walked the perimeter one last time. I stood near the center aisle. I watched the filtered lights settle on the metal canisters. I watched the ventilation grates hum at a steady frequency. I watched the dust motes drift in slow arcs. I felt no sadness. I felt no reluctance. I felt a quiet readiness to step into the next phase. I carried the routine with me. I knew it would not fade. I knew it would adapt. I knew it would wait for the next reel. I turned away from the inspection table. I walked toward the exit door. I packed my tools. I secured the workspace. I headed toward the stairwell. The brass handle turned smoothly. The corridor felt cool. The air carried the familiar scent of vinegar and aging paper. I breathed deeply. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt exactly where I needed to be. The door closed behind me. The basement settled into quiet. The shelves held their weight. The film rested in climate-controlled silence. I walked upward. The fluorescent light shifted to natural illumination. The city sounds returned gradually. I felt no rush. I felt no hesitation. I felt only the steady rhythm of the work. The archive continued. I continued. The quiet remained. The preservation felt complete. The presence felt sufficient. The stillness felt enough. I kept my steps even. I listened to the building hum. I waited for the next cycle. I stayed. Story 3. I did not expect a mountain road to end, where the pavement simply surrendered to gravel, and then to dirt, and then to nothing at all. The forest had grown thick on both sides, and the canopy pressed down like a heavy lid. My tires rolled over roots and loose stone, and the suspension complained in low, steady rhythms that matched the beating in my chest. I had been driving for hours past the last cell tower, and the last gas station, and the last sign that promised civilization. I was not looking for anything in particular. I was just following a set of coordinates, scribbled on a torn topographic map I had found tucked inside a used book about forgotten survey markers. The book had fallen open to a page marked with a faded red circle and a single line of ink that read, "Look up when the air grows still." I did not know what that meant, but I felt it in my shoulders as the engine cooled and the silence rushed in to fill the space where the road used to be. I stepped out into air that tasted of pine and damp earth and something faintly metallic, like old copper left out in the rain. The path ahead sloped upward through a tangle of ferns and fallen trunks and stone steps that had been swallowed by moss. I followed it without checking my phone or adjusting my pack or questioning why I was doing this. I just walked. The incline grew steeper. My breathing deepened. The trees began to thin, and the sky opened in patches above me, like torn paper revealing a pale blue underside. I reached the crest and stopped. The structure sat on the ridge like a sleeping animal wrapped in weather and time. It was not large. It was not grand. It was a low circular building with a domed roof that had lost half its copper sheathing to oxidation and gravity. A narrow service door hung slightly ajar on rusted hinges, and a stone foundation settled unevenly into the bedrock. A wooden stairway led up the side of the dome to a maintenance platform that sagged under decades of snow and wind and quiet neglect. I did not rush. I did not take photographs. I just stood at the base and let my eyes trace the lines of the architecture. The mortar between the stones had cracked in patterns that looked like river deltas. The wood had grayed to the color of storm clouds. The metal rails had warped slightly, but held their shape with stubborn grace. I walked up to the door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in a long, low tone that echoed inside the circular space. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow spirals. The air inside was cooler and carried a scent of dry paper and machine oil, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender pressed between heavy metal plates, until my boots made soft sounds on the stone floor. I let them ring out into the quiet. I did not try to fill the space with noise. I just listened. The dome interior was lined with iron brackets and wooden supports that formed a skeletal ribcage around a central pedestal. The pedestal held a massive brass and steel assembly that looked like a cross between a telescope and a clock. Gears of varying sizes interlocked in careful alignment. Counterweights hung from braided cables that ran through pulleys bolted to the ceiling. A series of dials and vernier scales sat along a curved control panel that had been protected from the worst of the weather by a glass case that had long since clouded with age. I approached slowly. I ran my hand along the edge of the control panel and felt the smooth, cool surface of polished brass beneath the dust. I traced the numbers etched into the scales. They were not digital. They were not laser-marked. They were cut by hand with precision that made my fingers pause. Each line represented a fraction of a degree. Each division represented a measurement of space that required patience to read. I did not know who had built this. I did not know when. I only knew that it had been waiting. I opened the access panel on the side of the pedestal and found a ledger bound in cracked leather. The pages were thick and yellowed, but the ink had held. The entries were written in a tight, careful hand that moved across the paper like a metronome. Dates, times, atmospheric conditions, gear tension readings, lubrication schedules, alignment checks. The last entry was dated over 40 years ago. It read simply, "Mechanism at rest, sky clear, and I will return when the wind shifts." No name, no signature, just a quiet promise left on paper. I closed the ledger gently. I did not remove it. I did not photograph it. I just let it rest where it had been left. I turned my attention to the mechanism. It was covered in a thin layer of dust and oxidized oil, but the structure beneath was sound. The gears showed no signs of cracking. The bearings looked intact. The cables had frayed slightly at the edges, but the cores held. I sat on the stone floor beside the pedestal and pulled a small toolkit from my pack. I did not plan to fix it completely. I did not plan to restore it to working order. I just wanted to understand how it moved. I started with the smallest gear. I wiped the dust away with a clean cloth. I applied a drop of light machine oil to the pivot point. I waited, and I watched the oil spread into the microscopic gaps. I turned the gear by hand. It resisted at first. Then it yielded. Then it moved with a smooth, quiet glide that sent a faint vibration through the stone and into my palms. I repeated the process on the next gear, and the next. I worked slowly. I did not rush. I let each movement teach me something about the tension and alignment and balance of the system. Hours passed. The light inside the dome shifted from pale blue to warm gold as the sun moved across the sky outside. I did not check the time. I did not feel hungry or thirsty. I was completely absorbed in the rhythm of cleaning and oiling and adjusting. The dust came away in soft clouds that caught the sunlight and drifted like slow snow. The oil darkened as it absorbed decades of oxidation and metal wear, and the brass beneath began to shine in patches like water catching fire. I moved to the main drive shaft. It was thicker than my forearm and connected to a series of planetary gears that rotated around a central axis. I placed both hands on the outer ring and pushed. It did not budge. I applied steady pressure. I felt the resistance build. I held it. I breathed out. The ring shifted a fraction of a degree, then another, then another. The sound was not loud. It was not grinding. It was a low, steady hum that resonated through the floor and up through my boots and into my legs. I felt it in my teeth. I felt it in my chest. It was the sound of something heavy and precise waking up. I stepped back and watched the counterweights respond. They rose slowly on their cables. They settled into new positions. They balanced the tension across the system. The dials on the control panel twitched. The needles moved from their resting positions and aligned with the etched markings. The vernier scales clicked into place with soft metallic kisses that echoed in the quiet dome. I did not try to force it further. I did not try to make it do anything it was not ready to do. I just let it find its own equilibrium. I sat down again and watched the light fade outside. The sky, through the open slit in the dome, shifted from gold to violet to deep indigo. The temperature dropped. The air grew still. I felt the quiet settle over me like a heavy blanket that did not smother, but supported. I closed my eyes and listened. The mechanism was still, but it was not dead. It was breathing in a way that only metal and stone and careful alignment can breathe. And I opened my eyes when the first star appeared through the slit. It was bright and sharp and unmoving. I looked at the main telescope tube. It was pointed slightly off-center. I reached up and adjusted the azimuth dial by a fraction of a degree. The gears responded with a soft click. The tube moved. I adjusted the elevation. Another click. Another movement. I aligned it with the star. I did not know what I was looking for. I did not know what it would show me. I just knew that it felt right. I placed my eye to the brass viewfinder. The lens was clean enough. The focus ring turned with smooth resistance. I adjusted it slowly. The star sharpened. It did not magnify dramatically. It did not reveal hidden details. It just grew clearer, steadier, more present. I pulled back and let the quiet wash over me again, and I realized then that this was not about seeing farther. It was about seeing better. It was about learning how to hold still long enough for the sky to reveal itself. I stayed through the night. I did not sleep. I sat on the stone floor with my back against the pedestal and watched the stars move through the slit in the dome. The mechanism shifted slightly as the earth turned. It did so without sound, without strain. Just slow, deliberate adjustments that kept the alignment true. I felt myself sinking with it. My breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. The constant hum of thought that usually filled my head quieted into a steady background rhythm that matched the rotation of the gears. I did not try to control it. I did not try to analyze it. I just let it happen. Morning came slowly. The sky lightened from indigo to pale gray to soft rose. The stars faded one by one until only the brightest remained. Then they too disappeared into the growing blue. I stood up and stretched. My muscles were stiff but not sore. My mind was clear but not empty. I walked to the control panel and checked the dials. They had settled into a new position that matched the morning sky. I did not reset them. I left them as they were. I packed my tools. I closed the ledger. I wiped my hands on a clean cloth. I stepped out onto the platform and looked at the horizon. The forest below was waking up. Birds moved through the canopy. Mist rose from the valleys in slow, rolling waves. The air felt different now. Lighter, cleaner, full of space. I walked down the path without looking back until I reached the tree line. Then I paused. I turned. The dome sat quietly on the ridge, as it did not look abandoned anymore. It looked rested. It looked like it had finally found someone willing to sit with it in the quiet. I drove home without turning on the radio. I did not check my phone. I did not replay the drive in my head. I just let the miles pass, and the scenery change, and the quiet remain. I went back to my routine. I answered messages. I attended meetings. I moved through days that felt familiar, but slightly different. The weight I had been carrying for years had not disappeared. It had just shifted. It no longer sat on my chest. It rested in my hands. I started noticing the small mechanics of my own life. The way my breath moved in and out. The way my footsteps landed on pavement. The way my eyes tracked the movement of clouds. The way my fingers rested on a keyboard or a steering wheel or a coffee mug. I did not try to fix anything. I did not try to optimize anything. I just paid attention. I began spending more time outside. I sat on benches and watched trees. I walked along rivers and listened to water move over stone. I stood under streetlights and watched moths circle in slow patterns. I did not expect to find meaning in it. I did not expect to find answers. I just found presence. I still think about the dome. Not with longing, not with regret, just with recognition. Like remembering a tool that fit my hands perfectly. I never tried to go back. I never tried to document it for others. I never tried to turn it into a project or a goal or a destination. Some places do not need to be revisited. Some places only work because they were visited once. And that is enough. And if you are reading this, you probably know what it is like to feel disconnected from your own rhythm. You probably know what it is like to move through days that feel like running on a treadmill that never stops. You probably know what it is like to want quiet but not know how to make room for it. I cannot tell you where to go. I cannot tell you what to adjust. I can only tell you this. Quiet is not something you find. It is something you allow. You allow it by slowing down, by listening without waiting for a response, by touching things without trying to change them, by sitting with mechanisms until they show you how they breathe. The dome did not need me to fix it. It just needed me to witness it, to oil its joints, to align its gaze, to let it move at its own pace, and in doing so, it gave me exactly what I did not know I was missing. So permission to stop rushing, permission to stop forcing, permission to stop measuring my worth by how much I could produce in a day. I learned that time is not a line. It is a cycle. It is a rotation. It is a slow, steady turning that does not require my participation to continue. It only requires my attention to be felt. I still sit with quiet things. I still watch gears turn in clocks that run on old batteries. I still listen to the hum of refrigerators and the tick of radiators and the slow drip of faucets that I finally fix instead of ignoring. I do not expect grand revelations. I do not expect sudden transformations. I just expect presence. And presence is enough. The sky will keep turning. The earth will keep rotating. The stars will keep moving through the darkened patterns that do not need my understanding to remain true. I do not need to decode them. I do not need to map them. I just need to look up when the air grows still. And when I do, I will remember the dome on the ridge. I will remember the brass and steel and stone. I will remember the slow glide of gears, and the soft click of dials, and the quiet hum of something heavy and precise finding its balance. I will remember that I do not have to be loud to be real. I do not have to be fast to be valuable. I do not have to be connected to everything to be whole. I just have to be present. I hope this helps you in whatever quiet way you need it. I hope it reminds you that you do not have to fix your life to feel at peace. You do not have to optimize your days to feel worthy. You do not have to chase the noise to find your place in it. Sometimes you just have to find a quiet place. Sit down, touch the brass, and watch the dust fall. Listen to the gears, and let the slow, steady rhythm teach you how to breathe again. The world will keep moving. The tasks will keep arriving. The expectations will keep shifting. But underneath all of it, there is a slower mechanism, a steadier rotation, a deeper frequency that does not need your attention to keep going. It just needs your presence to be felt. I found mine in a forgotten dome on a mountain that the sky still visits every night. You will find yours wherever you finally stop running long enough to sit. And when you do, you will realize you were never broken. You were just waiting for the noise to fade so you could hear your own rhythm again. To Story 4. The descent took 4 hours, and the transition from surface light to absolute dark felt like stepping through a threshold that closed behind me without sound. The tethered observation module lowered steadily through the water column, while pressure built against the hull, and the external cameras switched from daylight spectrum to infrared, and then to low-intensity illumination that revealed only suspended particulate drifting like slow snow. I sat in the pilot's seat with my hands resting on the control console and watched the depth gauge climb past the continental shelf and into the abyssal plain. The water temperature dropped in predictable steps. The ambient noise shifted from surface wave crash to distant vessel hum to the quiet resonance of deep ocean currents moving across the seafloor. The module settled onto a reinforced concrete anchor pad near a documented hydrothermal vent field. The thrusters engaged briefly to level the platform. The landing gear locked. The pressure equalization valves hissed once, and then held steady. I powered down the descent systems. I engaged the primary life support. I checked the hull integrity monitors. All readings returned within nominal parameters. The interior air felt cool and dry. The lighting adjusted to a warm, low wattage amber that kept the consoles visible without washing out the external camera feeds. I unclipped the safety harness. I stood slowly to let my equilibrium adjust to the stable gravity of the platform. I walked to the observation window. The reinforced acrylic showed only darkness beyond the external lamps. Yes, I knew the vent chimney stood 200 meters to the east. I knew the thermal plumes rose in slow spirals. I knew the extremophile colonies thrived in the mineral-rich outflow. I knew the environment would require patience. I accepted the assignment without hesitation. The surface world had grown too bright, too fast, too loud. I wanted depth. I wanted weight. I wanted a place where time moved according to pressure gradients and thermal cycles, rather than calendar dates and notification chimes. I secured the interior hatch. I began the orientation sequence. The first phase consisted of establishing operational baseline and familiarizing myself with the module architecture. The station operated as a self-contained habitat, equipped with redundant oxygen scrubbers, thermal regulation units, freshwater recyclers, and a bank of external sensor arrays calibrated for temperature, salinity, acoustic vibration, chemical composition, and particulate density. The control console featured dual display panels, manual override switches, automated logging software, and a tactile interface for drone deployment and tether management. I spent the initial days mapping the system layout. I verified the calibration certificates on the hydrophones. I tested the pressure seals on the sample retrieval arms. I inspected the external lighting mounts for corrosion or fatigue. The work felt deliberate. It required my hands and my attention, but not my urgency. I learned the rhythm of the space. The life support fans cycled every 40 minutes to maintain air circulation. The water recirculation pump hummed at a steady, low frequency, and the external cameras rotated slowly to cover the full 360-degree field of view. I walked the interior perimeter after each cycle. I checked the condensation levels on the lower bulkheads. I noted the pressure differentials on the gauge clusters. I wiped dust from the console screens. I recorded everything in the waterproof logbook. The pages accepted my pen without resistance. The ink dried quickly. The entries accumulated in neat columns. I felt my breathing slow. I felt my posture adjust to the quiet. The ocean above continued its surface rhythms, but the sound felt muffled by thousands of meters of water and reinforced steel. I slept in short blocks on the narrow bunk near the aft compartment. I woke to the pump hum. I checked the gauges. I resumed the rounds. The routine settled over me like a familiar weight. By the end of the second week, I noticed the first consistent anomaly in the acoustic returns. The hydrophones mounted near the eastern vent cluster recorded a series of low-frequency pulses that did not align with known tectonic activity or thermal vent release cycles. The signals arrived at regular intervals, but carried micro-variations in amplitude and pitch that suggested coordinated biological movement rather than mechanical or geological sources. I cross-referenced the data with regional seismic logs. I checked tidal current models for periodic flow shifts. I reviewed satellite bathymetry for structural changes on the seafloor. None of the external variables correlated with the acoustic output. I adjusted the receiver gain. I isolated the eastern array from the central hydrophone network, and I ran a diagnostic on the preamplifier circuitry. The equipment functioned within specification. The anomaly persisted. I recorded a continuous 24-hour cycle. I slowed the playback speed by half. I filtered out current turbulence and pump vibration artifacts. The pattern emerged clearly. It consisted of rhythmic pulses spaced at consistent intervals. The pulses carried subtle, harmonic overtones that shifted in frequency as the thermal plumes rose and fell. The sound did not feel random. It felt structured. I logged the discovery without speculation. I noted the exact timestamps. I documented the frequency ranges. I marked the amplitude thresholds. I saved the raw files to redundant drives. I transmitted the preliminary report. I received an automated acknowledgement. I continued the routine. The third week deepened the acoustic pattern. The pulses grew more defined. The micro-variations began to carry layered sequences that suggested multiple sources operating in synchronization. I deployed additional hydrophones along the thermal gradient boundaries mapped in the original survey data. I aligned the new sensors to capture vertical and horizontal pressure differentials. I calibrated the array for phase coherence. I recorded the evening cycle again. The data revealed a layered acoustic architecture. The primary pulses traveled through the upper water column. Secondary reflections bounced off the vent chimney walls. Tertiary harmonics emerged from the mineral-rich outflow zones, where extremophile colonies clustered. The sound moved through the water like light through a lens, and it fractured into distinct bands that recombined at specific intervals. I plotted the waveforms on graph paper. I measured the time delays between primary and secondary arrivals. I calculated the approximate distance between vocalizing organisms. The results matched known biological acoustics within acceptable margins. The anomaly was not an error. It was a natural communication phenomenon, amplified by the unique geometry of the vent field. I felt no urgency to explain it beyond the data. I felt only a quiet satisfaction at witnessing the environment operate exactly as its ecology dictated. I adjusted the recording schedule to prioritize thermal plume activity windows. I maintained baseline monitoring during dormant periods. I conserved equipment wear. I allowed the environment to dictate the pace, and the 4th week brought a shift in my perception of the recordings. I began to notice that the acoustic patterns changed slightly, depending on my proximity to the internal control console. I tested the observation deliberately. I placed a portable recorder at the center of the module. I walked to the aft bulkhead. I returned to the forward observation window. I compared the playback levels. The central recorder captured a slightly higher amplitude during periods of stillness. The peripheral sensors showed reduced sensitivity when I moved near them. I repeated the test at different times of day. The pattern held. The ocean did not react to my presence in a defensive or alert manner. It responded to the absence of vibration. When I stood still, the acoustic field stabilized, and when I moved, the hydrophones registered structural disturbance that masked the deeper resonance. I adjusted my field routine accordingly. I minimized unnecessary movement during recording windows. I approached the console slowly. I stood at a fixed distance from the central hydrophone feed. I allowed the microphones to capture the unfiltered signal. The recordings improved immediately. The clarity increased. The harmonic structure became more defined. I realized that deep ocean acoustic mapping requires more than equipment calibration. It requires environmental stillness. The water does not hide its patterns. It reveals them when the observer matches its rhythm. I accepted the constraint without resistance. I slowed my steps. I held my position. I listened. The 5th week introduced a new variable. The thermal vent activity increased, as the mineral chimneys released heavier plumes of superheated water. The surrounding temperature gradients shifted rapidly. The acoustic data showed increased low-frequency noise during high thermal discharge periods. The biological pulses remained detectable, but partially obscured. I adjusted the recording parameters. I engaged low-pass filters to remove thermal turbulence. I shifted the focus to hydrophone data that captured vertical pressure differentials, independent of water movement. The subsurface signal remained stable. The vent field continued its acoustic rhythm regardless of surface conditions. I felt no frustration. I adapted the methodology. I scheduled primary acoustic recording during calm thermal periods. I reserved high discharge events for hydrophone calibration tests, and I documented the correlation between plume intensity and signal degradation. I updated the data transmission logs. I maintained the routine. The module interior grew slightly warmer during peak discharge cycles. The ventilation system struggled to keep pace with external heat transfer. I adjusted the fan speed. I monitored the internal temperature. I ensured the equipment remained within operational limits. I drank water in measured increments. I rested during peak thermal activity. I worked during the cooler intervals. The ocean demanded endurance. I provided it. The 6th week brought the first clear view of the vent ecosystem. I deployed the external inspection drone and guided it toward the eastern chimney cluster. The cameras illuminated the mineral structures that rose from the seafloor like twisted spires, and the surfaces were coated in white and orange bacterial mats. The outflow zones carried dense clouds of suspended particulate. I maneuvered the drone slowly to avoid disturbing the delicate formations. I captured footage of extremophil colonies thriving in the superheated water. The organisms moved with deliberate slowness. They clustered near the chimney bases. They extended filtration appendages into the current. The drone audio feed carried the same acoustic pulses I had been recording. I listened through the internal monitors. The sound felt vast and contained. It did not demand attention. It offered it. I closed my eyes. I matched my breathing to the pulse of the resonance. I felt time stretch without friction. I did not count seconds. I did not measure duration. I simply occupied the space. The drone operated for 6 hours. The battery reserves held. The equipment functioned without strain. I saved the footage. I backed it to external drives. I logged the environmental conditions. I rested. The 7th week brought a shift in the data interpretation. I began to notice that the acoustic patterns contained micro-variations that correlated with tidal current shifts. I cross-referenced the timestamps with regional oceanographic models. The data showed consistent delays between tidal peak events and pulse amplification. The vent field acted as a natural hydrodynamic amplifier. It captured water compression waves and translated them into structured vibration. The sound did not originate solely from biological sources. It originated from the interaction between organism movement and current flow. The water functioned as a transmission medium, and it carried energy across distance. The pulses felt powerful, but controlled. I monitored the equipment limits. I adjusted the gain to prevent signal clipping. I logged the environmental variables. I saved the recordings. I waited. The tidal cycle passed through after 8 hours. The current slowed. The water settled. The vent field returned to baseline resonance. I inspected the drone feed. The sensors remained intact. The mounts held tension. The module seals maintained integrity. I cleaned the equipment. I resumed normal operations. I felt no urgency to analyze the data immediately. I let it rest. I trusted the storage systems. I returned to routine. The 8th week deepened the pattern recognition. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained recurring interval structures that matched fluid dynamic properties of vent plume dispersion. I consulted oceanographic references. I reviewed wave propagation models for hydrothermal outflow. The data aligned closely. The mineral particles arranged in geometric patterns that reflected and refracted pressure waves at specific angles. The vent field functioned as a natural acoustic resonator. The recurring intervals resulted from structural symmetry rather than random biological behavior. I documented the finding. I updated the research parameters. I adjusted the hydrophone placement to capture plume reflection angles. I recorded the thermal discharge cycle. The data confirmed the hypothesis. The harmonic structure matched theoretical models within acceptable margins. I felt no need to publish or present the findings immediately. I felt only satisfaction at witnessing the environment operate according to physical principles. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the array. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 9th week brought a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the work as a task to complete. I began viewing it as a practice to maintain. I no longer measured progress by data volume or transmission frequency. I measured it by attention quality and environmental alignment. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the ocean to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing patterns onto the data. I allowed patterns to emerge naturally. I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the acoustic cycles, and I noticed that my posture adjusted to the console layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the deep water rhythm. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent recording. The environment provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 10th week introduced a new observational layer. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered the recording settings. The effect was subtle but consistent. Adjusting the preamplifier bias shifted the harmonic balance. Changing the filter cutoff frequencies altered the perceived depth of the signal. Modifying the playback speed revealed hidden micro-variations. As I documented the equipment response. I tested each parameter systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with standard settings. I recorded identical cycles with modified settings. I compared the waveforms. The differences aligned with known acoustic processing principles. The ocean did not change. The recording chain changed. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained consistent settings for primary data capture. I reserved parameter adjustments for calibration tests. I avoided mixing processing variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent. I transmitted the results. I rested. The 11th week brought the first extended calm period. The thermal discharge stabilized completely. The temperature remained consistent. The atmospheric pressure above the surface held steady. The acoustic pulses reached maximum clarity. The harmonic structure displayed full interval complexity. The hydrophone array captured clean, deep water vibration. The data required minimal filtering. I recorded continuous cycles. I monitored the equipment limits. I logged the environmental conditions. I saved the files to multiple drives. I transmitted the complete data set. I received an automated acknowledgement. I felt no urgency to analyze the data. I let it rest. I trusted the storage systems. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I rested. The 12th week deepened the archival practice. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained recurring interval structures that matched acoustic properties of mineral lattice resonance. I consulted marine geology references, and I reviewed wave propagation models for hydrothermal chimney composition. The data aligned closely. The crystalline structures arranged in geometric patterns that reflected and refracted pressure waves at specific angles. The vent field functioned as a natural resonator. The recurring intervals resulted from structural symmetry rather than external influence. I documented the finding. I updated the research parameters. I adjusted the hydrophone placement to capture lattice reflection angles. I recorded the evening cycle. The data confirmed the hypothesis. The harmonic structure matched theoretical models within acceptable margins. I felt no need to publish or present the findings immediately. I felt only satisfaction at witnessing the environment operate according to physical principles. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the array. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 13th week brought a shift in my perception of time. I stopped measuring days by calendar dates. I began measuring them by recording cycles and environmental shifts. The boundary between days blurred. The routine became continuous. I woke when the temperature dropped. I worked when the current stabilized. I rested when the thermal discharge peaked. The cycle repeated without variation. I felt no fatigue. I felt no boredom. I felt only steady engagement. The work required presence. The environment provided structure. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 14th week introduced a new layer of environmental interaction. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered my breathing rhythm. The effect was subtle, but consistent. Slow, steady inhalation correlated with stable harmonic structure. Held breath correlated with slight amplitude increase. Sharp exhalation correlated with temporary signal distortion. I documented the observation. I tested the pattern systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with normal breathing. I recorded identical cycles with controlled breathing. I compared the waveforms. The differences aligned with known acoustic principles. The ocean did not react to my physiology. The reception environment responded to micro-vibration changes caused by body movement. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained steady posture during primary recording windows. I reserved movement for calibration periods, and I avoided mixing physiological variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent. I transmitted the results. I rested. The 15th week deepened the observational practice. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained micro-variations that correlated with lunar tidal gravitational effects. I cross-referenced the telemetry timestamps with regional oceanographic models. The data showed consistent delays between lunar peak events and pulse amplification. The vent field responded to subtle gravitational shifts through micro-pressure changes. I documented the observation. I updated the research parameters. I scheduled extended recording windows during lunar transitions. I monitored the output. The patterns held. The environment responded consistently. I felt a quiet awe at the scale of the interactions. The seafloor participated in celestial cycles. I adjusted my perspective. I stopped viewing the ocean as a static recording environment. I viewed it as a dynamic system connected to larger forces. I maintained my position. I continued the work. I allowed the data to accumulate. I did not force conclusions. I let the evidence speak. The 16th week brought a shift in my daily routine. I stopped tracking time by external markers. I began tracking it by environmental cycles and equipment rhythms. I woke when the temperature dropped. I worked when the current stabilized. I rested when the thermal discharge peaked. I aligned my schedule with the ocean rhythm, rather than imposing an external schedule onto the environment. The adjustment improved my efficiency. It reduced equipment strain. It minimized physical fatigue. I moved slower. I thought clearer. I observed more closely. I noticed the exact moment the mineral plumes expanded during heating. I noticed the way the bacterial mats thickened near outflow zones. I noticed the subtle color shift in the camera feed before pressure changes. I logged everything. I kept the entries precise. I avoided speculation. I stuck to observable facts. The work felt grounded. The environment felt responsive. I felt integrated. The module no longer felt like an isolated structure. It felt like a node in a larger network. The ocean communicated through vibration. I listened. I recorded. I adapted. The 17th week introduced a new layer of environmental interaction. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered the hydrophone array orientation. The effect was subtle, but consistent. Eastern alignment correlated with tighter harmonic spacing. Western alignment correlated with wider intervals. Northern alignment correlated with overlapping frequencies. Southern alignment correlated with stable baseline tones. I documented the observation. I tested the pattern systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with standard azimuth. I recorded identical cycles with modified bearings. I compared the waveforms. The differences aligned with known oceanographic propagation principles. The seafloor did not react to direction. The reception environment responded to micro-reflection angle changes caused by terrain interaction. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained steady sensor positions during primary recording windows. I reserved orientation adjustments for calibration tests. I avoided mixing directional variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent. I transmitted the results. I rested. The 18th week brought the first extended calm period. The thermal discharge stabilized completely. The temperature remained consistent. The atmospheric pressure above the surface held steady. The acoustic pulses reached maximum clarity. The harmonic structure displayed full interval complexity. The hydrophone array captured clean, deep water vibration. The data required minimal filtering. I recorded continuous cycles. I monitored the equipment limits. I logged the environmental conditions. I saved the files to multiple drives. I transmitted the complete data set. I received an automated acknowledgement. I felt no urgency to analyze the data. I let it rest. I trusted the storage systems. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I rested. The 19th week deepened the pattern recognition. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained recurring interval structures that matched acoustic properties of mineral lattice resonance. I consulted marine geology references. I reviewed wave propagation models for hydrothermal chimney composition. The data aligned closely. The crystalline structures arranged in geometric patterns that reflected and refracted pressure waves at specific angles. The vent field functioned as a natural resonator. The recurring intervals resulted from structural symmetry rather than external influence. I documented the finding. I updated the research parameters. I adjusted the hydrophone placement to capture lattice reflection angles. I recorded the evening cycle. The data confirmed the hypothesis. The harmonic structure matched theoretical models within acceptable margins. I felt no need to publish or present the findings immediately. I felt only satisfaction at witnessing the environment operate according to physical principles. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the array. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 20th week brought a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the work as a task to complete. I began viewing it as a practice to maintain, and I no longer measured progress by data volume or transmission frequency. I measured it by attention quality and environmental alignment. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the ocean to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing patterns onto the data. I allowed patterns to emerge naturally. I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the acoustic cycles. I noticed that my posture adjusted to the console layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the deep water rhythm. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent recording. The environment provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 21st week introduced a new observational layer. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered the recording settings. The effect was subtle, but consistent. Adjusting the preamplifier bias shifted the harmonic balance. Changing the filter cutoff frequencies altered the perceived depth of the signal. Modifying the playback speed revealed hidden micro-variations. I documented the equipment response. I tested each parameter systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with standard settings. I recorded identical cycles with modified settings. I compared the waveforms. The differences aligned with known acoustic processing principles. The ocean did not change. The recording chain changed. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained consistent settings for primary data capture. I reserved parameter adjustments for calibration tests. I avoided mixing processing variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent. I transmitted the results. I rested. The 22nd week brought the first signs of seasonal transition. The temperature swings decreased. The current patterns shifted direction. The atmospheric pressure stabilized at a higher baseline. The acoustic patterns adjusted gradually. The harmonic structure simplified slightly. The amplitude decreased within expected margins. I documented the shift. I updated the data models. I adjusted the recording schedule. I monitored the output. The patterns held. The environment adapted predictably. I felt no surprise. I felt only continuity. The seasons changed. The ocean responded. I maintained my position as I continued the work. I allowed the data to accumulate. I did not force conclusions. I let the evidence speak. The 23rd week deepened the observational practice. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained micro-variations that correlated with solar tidal gravitational effects. I cross-referenced the telemetry timestamps with regional oceanographic models. The data showed consistent delays between solar peak events and pulse amplification. The vent field responded to subtle gravitational shifts through micro-pressure changes. I documented the observation. I updated the research parameters. I scheduled extended recording windows during solar transitions. I monitored the output. The patterns held. The environment responded consistently. I felt a quiet awe at the scale of the interactions. Yet the seafloor participated in celestial cycles. I adjusted my perspective. I stopped viewing the ocean as a static recording environment. I viewed it as a dynamic system connected to larger forces. I maintained my position. I continued the work. I allowed the data to accumulate. I did not force conclusions. I let the evidence speak. The 24th week brought a shift in my daily routine. I stopped tracking time by external markers. I began tracking it by environmental cycles and equipment rhythms. I woke when the temperature dropped. I worked when the current stabilized. I rested when the thermal discharge peaked. I aligned my schedule with the ocean rhythm, rather than imposing an external schedule onto the environment. The adjustment improved my efficiency. It reduced equipment strain. It minimized physical fatigue. As I moved slower, I thought clearer. I observed more closely. I noticed the exact moment the mineral plumes expanded during heating. I noticed the way the bacterial mats thickened near outflow zones. I noticed the subtle color shift in the camera feed before pressure changes. I logged everything. I kept the entries precise. I avoided speculation. I stuck to observable facts. The work felt grounded. The environment felt responsive. I felt integrated. The module no longer felt like an isolated structure. It felt like a node in a larger network. The ocean communicated through vibration. I listened. I recorded. I adapted. The 25th week introduced a new layer of environmental interaction. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered my breathing rhythm. The effect was subtle but consistent. In slow, steady inhalation correlated with stable harmonic structure. Held breath correlated with slight amplitude increase. Sharp exhalation correlated with temporary signal distortion. I documented the observation. I tested the pattern systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with normal breathing. I recorded identical cycles with controlled breathing. I compared the wave forms. The differences aligned with known acoustic principles. The ocean did not react to my physiology. The reception environment responded to micro-vibration changes caused by body movement. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained steady posture during primary recording windows. I reserved movement for calibration periods. I avoided mixing physiological variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent, and I transmitted the results. I rested. The 26th week brought the first extended calm period. The thermal discharge stabilized completely. The temperature remained consistent. The atmospheric pressure above the surface held steady. The acoustic pulses reached maximum clarity. The harmonic structure displayed full interval complexity. The hydrophone array captured clean, deep water vibration. The data required minimal filtering. I recorded continuous cycles. I monitored the equipment limits. I logged the environmental conditions. I saved the files to multiple drives. I transmitted the complete dataset. I received an automated acknowledgement. I felt no urgency to analyze the data. I let it rest. I trusted the storage systems. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I rested. The 27th week deepened the pattern recognition. I began to notice that the acoustic sequences contained recurring interval structures that matched acoustic properties of mineral lattice resonance. I consulted marine geology references. I reviewed wave propagation models for hydrothermal chimney composition. The data aligned closely. The crystalline structures arranged in geometric patterns that reflected and refracted pressure waves at specific angles. The vent field functioned as a natural resonator. The recurring intervals resulted from structural symmetry rather than external influence. I documented the finding. I updated the research parameters. I adjusted the hydrophone placement to capture lattice reflection angles. I recorded the evening cycle. The data confirmed the hypothesis, and the harmonic structure matched theoretical models within acceptable margins. I felt no need to publish or present the findings immediately. I felt only satisfaction at witnessing the environment operate according to physical principles. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the array. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 28th week brought a shift in my internal state. I stopped viewing the work as a task to complete. I began viewing it as a practice to maintain. I no longer measured progress by data volume or transmission frequency. I measured it by attention quality and environmental alignment. I moved deliberately. I observed carefully. I recorded precisely. I allowed the ocean to dictate the pace. I stopped forcing patterns onto the data. I allowed patterns to emerge naturally. Yes, I noticed that my breathing synchronized with the acoustic cycles. I noticed that my posture adjusted to the console layout. I noticed that my thoughts slowed to match the deep water rhythm. I did not analyze the changes. I accepted them. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt present. The work required nothing more than steady attention and consistent recording. The environment provided everything else. I maintained the routine. I calibrated the equipment. I logged the variables. I transmitted the data. I rested. The 29th week introduced a new observational layer. I noticed that the acoustic patterns changed slightly when I altered the recording settings. The effect was subtle but consistent. Adjusting the preamplifier bias shifted the harmonic balance. Changing the filter cutoff frequencies altered the perceived depth of the signal. Modifying the playback speed revealed hidden micro-variations. I documented the equipment response. I tested each parameter systematically. I recorded baseline cycles with standard settings. I recorded identical cycles with modified settings. I compared the waveforms. The differences aligned with known acoustic processing principles. The ocean did not change. The recording chain changed. I adjusted my methodology accordingly. I maintained consistent settings for primary data capture. I reserved parameter adjustments for calibration tests. I avoided mixing processing variables with environmental variables. I kept the data clean. I kept the methodology transparent. I transmitted the results. I rested. The 30th week marked the end of the initial assessment cycle. The research consortium transmitted a standard notice. Phase 1 complete. Inventory verified. Preservation protocols updated. Data archive secure. I read the message. I acknowledged it. I began the transition sequence. I powered down non-essential equipment. I backed up the digital logs. I sealed the hydrophone array. I cleaned the surfaces. I checked the tether tension. I walked the perimeter one last time. I stood at the observation window. I watched the external lamps illuminate the mineral chimneys. I watched the thermal plumes rise in slow spirals. I watched the suspended particulate drift through the water. I felt no sadness. I felt no reluctance. I felt a quiet readiness to step back into the wider world. I carried the depth with me. I knew it would not fade. I knew it would adapt. I knew it would wait for the next quiet moment. I turned away from the window. I walked toward the ascent control panel. I packed my gear. I secured the module. I initiated the tether retraction. The winch hummed in the distance. The water pressure decreased gradually. I breathed deeply. I felt grounded. I felt clear. I felt exactly where I needed to be. The platform rose steadily through the dark. The temperature increased gradually. The light returned in slow gradients. I sat in the pilot seat. I watched the depth gauge descend. I watched the external cameras switch to infrared and then to daylight spectrum. I watched the surface approach. I felt the vibration of the ascent through the floor. I felt the cool water shift around the hull. I felt the steady rhythm of the tether pulling upward. I did not think about the city. I did not think about the next assignment. I did not think about the data. I thought about the resonance. I thought about the harmonic structure. I thought about the quiet that lived inside the pressure. I thought about how easy it is to forget that the world does not require our constant input to function. It simply exists. It moves. It shifts. It breathes. We only need to notice. I closed my eyes. I let the motion carry me. I let the sound anchor me. I let the moment hold me. The platform broke the surface. The sunlight flooded the observation window. The ocean stretched out in every direction. I stayed awake without effort. I watched the horizon hold steady. I listened to the water settle. I felt the stillness travel through me. I knew I would carry it forward. I knew it would outlast the rotation. On that I knew it would outlast the job. I knew it would outlast the noise. I smiled without reason. I breathed without counting. I existed without explanation. The recovery vessel approached. The crew moved into position. The tether detached with a soft release. I stepped onto the deck. The air felt light. The wind carried the scent of salt and open water. I felt no urgency. I felt no hesitation. I felt only the steady rhythm of the journey. The vessel moved toward the shore. The coastline drew closer. The infrastructure multiplied in the distance. I felt no resistance. I felt only the quiet certainty that I had learned exactly what I came for. The engine hummed. The hull cut through the swell. The sky deepened toward dusk. I stayed present. I watched the water reflect the light. I listened to the vessel move. I felt the depth remain within me, and I knew it would hold. I knew it would guide me. I knew it would quiet the surface noise. I kept my steps even. I listened to the wind. I waited for the next descent. I stayed.